unseen sovereign, the unseen king, the king who's, as it were, working in the shadows. And the title of this week's sermon, each sermon will have a different title. This week is Complications, and it's recognizing that we live in a difficult world that sometimes seems, quite frankly, mad and is messy. But God is still there at work, the unseen sovereign, working, as that title, as that even image seeks to show, from the shadows. He is known, or the book of Esther, I should say, is known, amongst other things, for not even mentioning God. So he's this unseen sovereign, you could even say silent sovereign, not even mentioned in the whole book. And yet, as we look at the book and we have eyes to see and ears to hear and we seek to perceive his presence, we can see that he is sovereign, that he is ruling, that he is reigning still, even in the craziness of what's going on in this book. He is, as we've said, working in the shadows, but he is most definitely working. We can see, even though it's unseen in some ways, we can see his majesty and his might, and we can see that it's incomparable to any human rulers. And there's a big focus here on a particular king, King Xerxes. And yet he seems to be this all-powerful person, but actually compared to God, this man's rule is stoppable and it's temporary. God's rule and reign is unstoppable and it's forever. And whatever madness or mess that is happening in this world, God is still working, and he's working all things together for the good of those who are his people, those who love him and follow him, and he's also working all things for his glory. And some people have asked, why does this book not mention God at all? And there could be a technical reason for that. We've not really got time to go into it. It could be because it's Mordecai, who is one of the characters in this book, who ends up, we're told in Esther chapter 10, the prime minister of the whole empire. And so maybe he writes this book not only for Jewish audience, but even for Persian audience, but he's being very careful about what he says. But actually, anyway, by not mentioning God, it's also maybe to highlight to us that when God maybe seems the most distant, even absent, is maybe when he's most present and most at work. It's just this book challenges us to see it, to seek for it, to fix our eyes on it, to find it, to focus on what is unseen, to see really then what matters most in life. And what does matter most? What matters most to you in life? What matters most to you for your family? What matters most to other people? What matters to the people of this world? What seems to matter most to people? The book of Esther is seeking to remind us and encourage us to see beyond the things of this world, what's obvious and what seems to be the priorities of most people, and see that can be fleeting and also futile. And what matters most is to look for and be part of the eternal, the everlasting, the divine, to see God himself, the divine, see God at work. If that all sounds a bit, I think Paul puts it in a really simple way for us to understand. This is what I'm trying to say. He says it much better. So, we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. The what is unseen is the divine hand of God, this unseen sovereign that we're talking about. His providence, him working all things together for the good of those who love him and for his eternal purposes in the background. And it's unseen apart from to his people who can perceive it, who are looking for it, who have eyes to see and ears to hear, who are focusing, as Paul says, they're fixing their eyes on this and seeking to see his hand at work and find what he's doing. And so in many ways, as we do that with Esther, even though God's not mentioned, as we seek, as we fix our eyes on what's unseen, what's happening in the shadows, it's there to encourage us, this book, to remind us that God is at work. It's a little bit like the story of Joseph. So it's a very well-known story, Joseph. He went through all kinds of mess and madness, all kinds of trouble, and yet he ends up the second most important person in Egypt and in a position to save the many lives from famine. So he says this in Genesis 50 verse 20, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." And the book of Esther is offering a similar encouragement and assurance that when we find ourselves like Esther does or Mordecai in a messed up world that seems mad and even dangerous at times, we can still trust that God is working for his people and working out his purposes in the world, his eternal purpose, his divine purposes of significance that matter. So like I say, God's not mentioned, but his rule and his reign, his sovereignty, his providence is there in the background of this book. He is working in what is unseen. And this is in great contrast to what is seen, because the book very much shows us what is seen, and it focuses not on the eternal king, but on this human king, King Xerxes. So in fact, what we know and learn about him is very seen. It's almost in your face. It's totally. He's in chapter 1. He's the focus really in his kingdom. And again, like I say, it's there to contrast it with the King of Kings who's behind the scenes. So in a very simple way, chapter 1 and chapter 2, I don't know if you've got your Bibles, you'll see it's a lot. We're not going to read the whole thing, don't worry. And we're not going to comment on every part of it. But from a sort of overview perspective, chapter 1 is about what is seen. Chapter 2 is about what is unseen, or we begin to see God at work in what is unseen. So we've got these two chapters that we're going to have a sort of overview of. And the first chapter, chapter 1, gives us this picture of one of the greatest kings the world has ever known. And this is what it tells us. So chapter 1, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. So already we're told this guy is so important, right? At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, his princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, he displayed, so I emphasize that, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. The garden and hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. Excavations of this palace and this city have revealed that it was a citadel. So he didn't just have a palace, he had a city within a city. The citadel was where all his servants and his workers, maybe civil servants, everybody who served him would live and work. And it was separate from the rest of the city for safety, I suppose, to protect the whole thing. But in this city, or this citadel, as well as his palaces, there was everything you can imagine. The ornamentation of the palace sounds breathtaking. This is confirmed again from history. He's got stuff from all over the kingdom. He's brought everything to his one palace and displaying it for all to see, which seems to be very much his motive for getting everyone together, is to show everyone how great he is. He tells us, verse 4, he displayed his vast wealth. to those who were present. So he's been pursuing possessions, but maybe part of his pursuing possessions is actually pursuing prestige. He wants respect and admiration. He wants people to perceive him as being successful. And I think, again, we're seeing in this king, obviously on a big scale, something that we see in the world in general and maybe even in our own hearts, that this so often is what matters to people. What matters most to us often can be possessions, but sometimes we don't even know why we want them. Maybe it is because of prestige. Maybe we want to impress people. Some people may be tempted to just do things and buy things in order to look good to others. And our current culture is very concerned, and there's a pressure as well on image. But another reason why he's pursuing possessions and pursuing prestige is actually he's after more power. He's the most powerful person on the planet. He rules over 127 provinces, it tells us, from India to Ethiopia. And actually at that time, that was kind of the known world, at least. Sort of from a historic point of view, that all sorts obviously happening throughout the world, but at that time that was the sort of focus, and he basically thought he pretty much had conquered the whole world, except he knew he needed or wanted to get Greece as well. And so part of his motive for having this massive feast it's the real reason for this feast is that he wants more power. He wants to get all these nobles, all these princes, all these heads of these 127 provinces to be fully behind him in his desire to take over Greece. According to historians, the mention of the third year of the king's reign, which is in verse 3, is coincides with him going to Greece. So this whole endeavour to impress people is actually to get more people to follow him to battle. A historian from near the time, Herodotus, he estimated that he actually had at his disposal up to 2.5 million fighting men, which some historians reckon might be an exaggeration, but even so, there are poems, there are history books, there's all sorts of evidence to say that he took with him hundreds of thousands of men into battle. And this banquet was this was the rallying time. This is the way to get everyone behind him in his pursuit of power. And it's to leverage more power. The extravagance is a deliberate attempt to almost buy them, to get them on his side. For sharing in his pleasures, the pleasures of the palace, he wants them to share their lives. For unlimited alcohol, he wants unlimited loyalty. I mean, the extravagance is incredible. But actually, surely it's not just because he's pursuing power. When you look at it, it's 180 days of feasting. That's like 6 months. I mean, that's crazy. That's extravagance to its extreme. And then there's a sort of second party of 7 days, and that's just for the civil servants, the people living in the citadel itself. So the nobles, the princes, they have 180 days, and then everybody else in the citadel gets 7 days. He wants them to be fully behind him as well and helping him in this pursuit. But if you think about it, it's also just pursuing pleasure for pleasure's sake. If he has that kind of money and that kind of opportunity, then surely in his mind it's, if it feels good, let's do it. So all these things that we're highlighting in the king, I wonder if you agree, they can be seen in what the world pursues today. What we can be tempted to as well: possessions, prestige, power, pleasure. But actually, this pursuit is something that is, as we've said already, fleeting and also futile. In fact, it can lead to a right mess, a madness, and that's what happens here. Things take a turn for the worst when, after he's pretty drunk, he wants to show off to everybody the beauty of his wife. So let's just read that. On the 10th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Well, he called for her to be brought to him in attempt to sort of further boost his respect and honour himself, and using her almost as an object, like one of his possessions. But she doesn't want to be treated like one of his possessions. She has free will, and she refuses to come. She won't bow to his will, and this refusal enraged the king. And what it did in front of all these nobles and all these people from all these provinces, it questioned his authority. Again, it could make him look not as powerful and prestigious as he'd want to be. And so, feeling shamed and pained, maybe like a little boy who's lost his toy, he makes up a number of rules, one of them being that his queen can no longer come into his courtroom. Actually, she won't be queen anymore. He just makes this rule. And then, so as not to lose face, he makes another rule, that throughout the kingdom, every woman is told that she will respect her husband from the least to the greatest. So he makes this a rule. And not only does he make it a rule, he sends dispatches all over the kingdom to every province. These are verses 13 to 22. We're not going to read them. Written in everybody's language from all those provinces so that they know this is the king's order. The women cannot be like Vashti. The women have to submit to their husbands and respect them and so on. But respect is something in the head and the heart, right? So he's actually trying to control people's will. He couldn't control Vashti's, but now he wants to control every single person in the whole province. We're talking about sending messages out to every single home, trying to have control over every person and what they do in their own home and over their thoughts and over their minds. Such is the madness of this insatiable desire to control and have power. But this isn't good. He's already been shamed in front of the nobles, maybe caused people to question his authority. He then sends so many resources throughout the kingdom to try and control people's minds and thoughts and will. And it's maybe no surprise then that in the next 3 years, despite having hundreds of thousands of soldiers at his disposal, he still loses the battle in Greece. Sometimes the world does mad things and it's absurd, and it leads to a mess. And in this case, the mess is also that Queen Vashti is no longer his queen. She is banished from his presence, but actually historians reckon and read into some of even the language that is used here. When it uses the word decree, that can mean cut off, and they believe that she was probably executed, if not banished, to far away from everyone and everything. That was the end of her life in many ways, whatever happened. This world it's mad and it's messy, but it's dangerous. And for Vashti, that's how it was. It was dangerous not to submit. But as we go into chapter 2, we continue to see how nobody is safe from nasty and narcissistic, pleasure-seeking, power-seeking people. And that, again, is a challenge to us today. As we look at the world, it might seem quite impressive, like it does in chapter 1, doesn't it? This impressive and, wow, all that power and pleasure and possessions. But actually, what it leads to, where it ends up, and what's behind it as well, should be a challenge to us as well about pursuing such things. These things are futile and fleeting, but also can cause such harm and hurt to others' people when the pursuit is just my power, my pleasure, what I want. And this king is like that. He is seeking what he wants here in chapter 2, but thankfully, on a more positive note, we see behind the scenes that God is still at work behind things. So we read in chapter 2, and we're not going to read much of it. If you read it later, you'll probably understand why. It's pretty seedy, pretty sad situation. Hundreds of young women are snatched from their families. Maybe they had hopes of having their own home and family, and that is broken and destroyed when the king's officials come and take them away to potentially be his queen. Hundreds of them. Only one can be the queen, so the rest will end up ultimately kind of slaves. Similarly, lots of young men are snatched from their homes and the potential and their dreams of maybe marriage and a home and a family, because they're castrated and made eunuchs to serve the king and to look after these hundreds of potential wives for the king. This is the way of the world. It uses, it abuses. This is the way of selfishness. In contrast to this king, we have a king in the Bible who came here 2,000 years ago, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, who didn't come to be served, but came to serve and even give his life for us. He came to rescue. He came to restore. He came to give, not like this king, to take for his selfish gain. And for all its seemingly impressiveness and greatness of this king, actually, we see already that this whole thing is a sad mess and a mad state of affairs. But as I say, there's hope here. In chapter 2, we're introduced to a family. Now, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Joachim, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther also was taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Hegai, who had charge over the harem. She pleased him and won his favour. Immediately he provided her with the beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So without going into loads of detail, hopefully that is telling you the story itself. Last week Jack told us the whole story. What happens? She is basically raised to this position of queen. As she gets there, she finds all kinds of favours, could be described as God incidences, so that she gets to this position where she is able to ultimately save God's people from annihilation, the Jewish people, at this time. And we see in this that in this mess and this madness, God is working. He's working through the lives of this family for his purposes and for the good of his people, to save them. And what this teaches us is that we cannot often tell what God is doing in the mess of this world and the madness of this world, and maybe the mess and madness of our own lives that we might find ourselves in even right now. I don't know if that's what your situation is and your concerns right now, but you may be facing what could be described as madness and mess. But God is working his purposes out, even in the mess and the madness. From the human eye, what is seen when Jesus died on the cross probably seems madness and mess. But when it's looked at from the unseen perspective, that God is at work, that is where our salvation was purchased. So even in the mess and the madness of the cross and what Jesus had to go through, we gained salvation. And Esther, the story of Esther, reminds us that God is in control. God has a plan, and even in the worst of things, he can and he does work for his glory and for our good. Even if it is in the shadows and behind the scenes, God is at work in the mess and the madness. What God is doing as well isn't futile and fleeting. It isn't just here and now, but it's of eternal significance and has eternal results. Sometimes we might not see it in the moment. Sometimes it's afterwards. We look back and we see how God was working all things together for good. And in that moment, we just have to keep doing what Paul suggested we did. Fix our eyes, not on what is seen, not what's obvious and what is happening in the world, but on what is unseen, what God is doing. Since what is seen is temporary, it's passing, but what is unseen is forever. It's eternal. It's what matters most. What God is doing, what God wants for us is more important than what the world may tell us we need. And so sometimes when things are tough and difficult, we have to trust in the providence of God that he is working for our good. He's working in the unseen, and the unseen is about the greatness of God and the goodness of God, the fact that he is reigning, the fact that he rules, and he is working for his glory and our good. And so in all the mess and all the madness of this world and even our own lives, we do not need to fear, but we can continue to look to him, follow him, seek him, find him, trust him, and even as we come to a close now, praise him, recognizing that our God is greater, that our God reigns.
And if our God is for us, then who could ever stop us? And if our God is with us, then what could stand